Welcome, everybody, to another Photon Insider Fireside chat. Today, we have a special guest who will be joining us on stream and talking about one of their in-house projects they built called Fusion Pong. And without further ado, let me bring in our guest for today. Hello, Marty. Welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
All good. I mean, you're pretty much at the end of your day already here down under. We are just starting here over in Europe, but I think that is the perfect time to like grab everybody that's in between our two time zones and get chatting on a couple of multiplayer topics.
Yeah, it's always funny trying to find the right times when you've got teams between Australia, Europe, stuff like that. But yeah, around about now seems to be the time that works for everyone. So, I mean, hopefully you're having a good morning so far.
Well, meeting new people is always a good time for me. So, yes, I do. So as I mentioned to your viewers just a couple seconds ago, is we will be talking about Fusion Pong. But before we dive into the project, tell me about well what you do specifically, but also what Noma Studio does in the space of multiplayer.
Yeah, of course. So my name's Marty. I'm a senior developer with Noma Studios. We're based in Sydney, Australia. I've been working in the games industry now for I don't know too long. I think I'm coming close to a decade in the industry or something like that, roughly. So it's been a while. But yeah, definitely been a very fun time. But yeah, so No More Studios ourselves. We're a game studio based in Sydney. But we're a little bit different to a lot of traditional game studios. We do create our own games. We've shown things off at conferences like PAX Australia, stuff like that in the past. But outside of that, we're also a consultancy. So a big part of No More Studios' mission is we assist other businesses or other game studios specifically by providing either technical capacity or technical capability towards various projects.
Well,
And especially in the last few years, a big part of the work that we've been doing is specifically around multiplayer games.
wow. Well, yeah, I mean, multiplayer games are something that we also hear a lot about, like wanting people to have consultancy on because it is so radically different from, well, single player. And so it's always great to hear, okay, there are people dedicated and actually helping people join that new space, given how different it is.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
well, speaking of that difference, what place like how do you help people on board? Like we know through the last stream that you had with Eric over on the Nomos Studio channel that you do have these live streams on your end to help customers and other people in your community learn about new tools. But what else do you do, and how does Fusion Pong play into it?
Yeah, cool. That's a really awesome question. So a big part of what we try to do as a studio is support and uplift both our local community and just, I guess, the game development community at large. To that end, we obviously put out a lot of content through our website, on our blog, and our social media and stuff like that, which I think Anne's in chat at the moment. They might be able to pop some links in there as needed and stuff like that. And obviously on our YouTube channel, we do a lot of live events. Like I said, obviously we did one specifically looking at Photon Fusion. I know we've done one in the past on, say, game production or things like that. So we generally try, like, talks we do at conferences and just generally any sort of valuable resources that we can sort of put together and put out there for the community is a big thing that we enjoy doing, and we try to do as much as we can. Um, Specifically Fusion Pong, we decided we wanted to do a little bit of talk. We called it Photon Fusion 101. We wanted to put together like basically a live event a few months ago now, I believe it was, where we basically gave people a high level introduction to Fusion specifically, but also just to multiplayer development in general. And I mean, me talking for an hour would be pretty boring. So we're like, well, I had a few hours free one night, and I'm like, well, let me put together like a super quick little demo to actually have something that we could actually play and show on the stream, and obviously talk about like how we go through the
Mm.
development process. And since then, we actually this has been a really cool little tool. There's some developers actually on our Discord who are using Fusion Pong as a basis to then go and create their own little Pong-based games, which is really cool to see. It's all open source and stuff like that. The repo is public. Um, and yeah, like outside of that, it's a good sort of introductory sort of project to give someone like that high level overview of how to actually put together a multiplayer project and a fusion project, I guess, more specifically.
So, I mean, you said it just took you a couple hours one evening. I mean, granted, Pong is the quintessential multiplayer game, not only one of the first multiplayer games, but one of the very first games that actually was commercially available. So, it's kind of a throwback there as well. But aside from that, like how much experience did you have when you decided to do the project, and how how much different would you think this experience would have been if somebody just did it from scratch, like by just starting the first day?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, yeah, I was able to put this together in a night. I've got a little bit of an advantage though, because obviously I work full time in Fusion-based projects. I've been doing that basically ever since Fusion was sort of announced last year or whenever it was. It's been a while now. In terms of someone completely starting from scratch, like assuming they have at least a level of understanding of Unity and could say put together a single player version of a game like Pong. Um, I would say again using say a mixture of say YouTube and like Fusion documentation. I'd be surprised if someone couldn't put together something similar to this in say a day or two or a couple of days. Um, like I said, Fusion obviously is again I've got a bit of an advantage. So I've worked with it quite a bit, but Fusion is a relatively straightforward sort of networking stack to actually use. Obviously, there's some great documentation out there. There's good community support through like Discord and stuff like that. But yeah, it's definitely we deliberately picked, or I picked Pong as the game to make because it is just that most simple possible multiplayer. Or maybe there's something a bit more simple, but it's one of the most simple games you can sort of put together. Because at the end of the day, we didn't want the focus so much to be on the actual gameplay itself. I'll be the first to admit this is not the most exciting game I've ever put together. Um, maybe it is, I don't know. Maybe my games aren't that great, but hopefully they are. But yeah, like I said, the focus was much more on the actual like networking multiplayer, the actual like way that the game is put together, more so than the actual gameplay itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also the important aspect well, not necessarily multiplayer as a matter of fact, but when you start using a new tool to test out the waters. One thing that we have seen, like, is even the most experienced developers that we've seen joining and using these different products, they start oftentimes literally with a ball that just jumps on the playground, like nothing fancy or really complicated with shooting mechanics from the get-go. It's like step by step working into the complexity because well, it's new. You need to learn what are the paradigms. Well, of course, the API specifics to a particular SDK, but also just the mindset, I think, changes when you move from like, okay, it's all on my machine to, oh crap, now it needs to work on everybody's machine in a way that seems to be synchronous despite, the internet not being instantaneous to begin with.
Yeah, that's definitely a very common thing that we come across with a lot of the clients we work with, and even like within ourselves, like onboarding like new team members and developers in general, is that yeah, multiplayer development does take a different sort of mindset, especially when you need to start thinking about that. I'm controlling an object that I can see on my screen, but how is that object going to appear on someone else's screen? What information do I actually like? What is the minimum amount of information I need to send from my computer to someone else's computer so that they can see everything that I need them to be able to see?
Hmm.
And even then, like the opposite sort of way of thinking to that is what information do I have about my player, my character, what's in my character's backpack, those sort of things. I don't want other players to have access to. Quite often we run into situations where you'll end up where yeah, I can just network every single variable about a player object or a car or a tank or whatever it happens to be, but for a variety of reasons, ignoring the fact that the internet is a terrible means of communication in terms of reliability and speed and routing and stuff like that.
Hmm.
But you may just not want every other player to know how many bullets you have left, or how much gold you're carrying, or stuff like that. So yeah, it's definitely once you start going down that rabbit hole of thinking about multiplayer development, it's a really exciting field, and obviously we feel very privileged to have the opportunity to work on these sort of games that get to do this sort of thing, and create those sort of connected social experiences, which are just obviously super fun to share with everyone.
Yeah, I think you pointed out an interesting thing about the internet. As a matter of fact, something that we also need to emphasize oftentimes is that we often, as just users who go and watch Netflix or go on a website, it all feels like pretty snappy. Everything calms down, but this is just a downstream. Plus, a lot of it for instance, with video and in YouTube, well, there's still buffering, so you don't actually see the wait time as much. Whereas in video games and multiplayer games, the more fast paced it is, the more real time you need that exchange to be. And of course, we are limited at most by the speed of light because it's still information going through cables. So even the best of scenarios, we would still have a delay. And we kind of need to fake that responsiveness. Well, in this case, in with client side prediction, interpolation, and other stuff, right? So this is definitely something that you need to kind of like think about at first because yes, it's different. Things are not happening. Oh, I press a button. I press the button on that other machine at the same time.
Mm. I know, and we touched on this a bit with my chat with Eric and stuff like that in the past. The difference between like determinism or non-deterministic simulations and how that can obviously affect the way that you would network them together and stuff like that. I mean, we can definitely touch on fusion versus quantum or the differences between those sort of engines
Hmm.
and or ways of networking. Um, but yeah, I remember years and years ago there was a talk at GDC by one of the members of the team that made Rocket League,
Hmm.
talking about all the work that had to go into creating that sort of multiplayer simulation. And that's a team that had years and years of experience doing specifically like vehicle networking in Unreal, obviously for that one. Um, and yeah, the amount of work it takes to network a physics-based object is absolutely incredible. And the fact that with a tool like Fusion, I can literally just drop a network rigid body. I mean, there's a bit more work to it than that, but generally speaking, you drop a network rigid body and it works.
Hmm.
Um, is is incredible, and it really does open up a breadth of possibilities for the sort of multiplayer games. I mean, we're seeing this now. You just have to look at the sort of games that were being created with, say, something like Pun, compared to what we're seeing now with Fusion and Quantum. It's unlocking incredible possibilities for developers. Um,
Yeah. Well, I think here you made a very good point, and that is they're tools, and I think especially more so the programmer among us developers than other members on our teams. We go like, oh, but I want to solve every single problem myself because it's cool and I like solving problems. But if we look at it as a business, the question is how, like, what do we do? Do we build games or do we make tools that allow us to build games? Now, of course, there's some r- enormous studios in this world that build their own engines with their own net stack, but they're usually very game specific nonetheless. I mean, Frostbite, whether we're thinking about Frostbite for EA or Snowdrop for Ubisoft, those are all engines that, while being modular, they're still made for a certain type of game, rather than being a generic solution for everybody. So,
yeah, it's absolutely, and it's we and again this is a conversation we have with clients quite often, where yeah, cool. We could all go right back to OpenGL and C++ and create every single thing from scratch. But at the end of the day, as you said, it's do we want to make games or do we want to make game engines? Do we want to build tools or build game? Although would game developers build tools? That's a whole other debate there, really. Um, but yeah, like in the same way that I mean, for example, we obviously use Unity quite a lot for a lot of the development that we do. Because we don't want to have to write an engine from scratch, and we accept the fact that we've chosen Unity as a tool that we enjoy using. In that same way, using something like Fusion or any networking stack really. Like there are other options out there, obviously. Fusion happens to be one that lines up quite nicely for a lot of the projects that we work on. Um, but yeah, it's similar to the decision of using say Cinemachine or TextMesh Pro or DoTween, which is one of the most amazing Unity plugins that everyone should know about. Hopefully everyone does. But yeah, there's yeah, as you said, it really does come down to that decision of do you want to build games or build game engines being the big thing.
Yeah. A discussion I have also like with a lot of friends in the dev community in general, especially like the smaller the team or the more indie you go, the more like I want to be able to have insights into everything. And I mean, at some point, unfortunately, you got bills to pay and you need to get to market. So, from a purely business perspective, it's also not only what is your core focus, but like how long can you delay that next paycheck until basically having revenue again. So I think if you can facilitate or speed up that process, then it's good for you as a studio and for your game as well because you get more time to iterate on its core functionality and the core gameplay experience for the end user. But how about like okay, we spoke a ton about the tools, and I know we could keep going on there, but let's circle back to like Fusion Pong itself. So you mentioned you built that because you had a stream coming up. Did you use it only for that stream, or do you also use it in your community or with your clients to well for other purposes in any way?
Yeah, so like I said, the primary goal of building Fusion Pong was as I said. So when we were doing that live stream talking about Fusion, we'd have something a bit more interesting to actually be able to go through and actually show actual code, show an actual working project. And obviously then we've released it as a public repo since then. As I said, internally we use it as a good little onboarding tool as a way to show developers like more of an introductory approach to Fusion. And we've also found it quite handy when we're talking with clients about doing multiplayer games,
Hmm.
not necessarily talking to the developers on the actual, or sorry, specifically I should say the programmers maybe within a client team that we're talking to, but we've actually found it to be really handy when we're talking to say designers, artists, maybe producers, the more like non-technical members of a team to go like, hey, this please don't think that multiplayer is out of the realm of possibility for what your team can achieve. Please don't think that just because you're a smaller, maybe indie team, that you have to stick to single player experiences. Like, here's an example, of something that can be put together very, very quickly. And one of the things with Fusion Pong that we actually did is it started out as a single player project. If you actually go into the repo, you can see that the initial commits are a purely single player game, and
Okay.
then we converted it basically to a multiplayer game. And again, that was a very deliberate decision because we wanted to have that ability to show people like, hey, like, you might go make a really cool single player game, but it doesn't have to just be a single player game. If it's the right fit, it's not out of the realm of possibility. And again, this is very much depending on the game, depending on the architecture and stuff like that. I don't, please do not quote me as saying that any single player game can or should be converted to a multiplayer game. But it's
Oh, that's a
great to have
very core design decision. Like I've
it.
gotten we get that question a lot. It's like, hey, um, can we make this multiplayer? The question is really never can you make it multiplayer? That's always an option, but rather does it add to your experience? Is your experience inherently better or more fun or different? As a matter of fact, like your single player experience doesn't have to be the same as your multiplayer experience. If it is cooperative or if you're several people doing the same action in that world. So I think this is also an important thing to keep in mind. It's just like if you want to make a single player game, build a single player game. If you want to build a multiplayer game, build it one or build both. But it doesn't have to be the same thing either.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, definitely being able to show people that a project can start its life as a single player project and then become a multiplayer game. And there's multiple different ways to approach that. And we've done many different ways of doing that. Whether it's a project that's still in development or even something that's been fully released.
Mhm.
A game might get released. Turns out it gets quite a good following. It's quite popular. And from that success, the team's then able to make the decision, or maybe based on community feedback of like, hey, we want to take this game maybe from a couch co-op game to a full online multiplayer experience,
Right.
or something along those lines.
So here, I need to jump on a point you just said. Uh, this game started as a single player game and then became a multiplayer game. Now,
Yes.
this was, of course, possible because, as we said, Pong is very straightforward, right? From its mechanics, from its code base. But okay, so we're jumping here on a very hot button topic, one that we, of course, have our own opinion on, both as individuals, but and also as a company. Is, of course, you can add multiplayer, make a single player game into multiplayer game, but I think we would be remiss into omitting the amount of work that has to be done to switch the code base over to something that is multiplayer ready. So it
Oh,
can be
absolutely.
done,
Yeah.
but like I want to make sure that we have a big asterisk there. Is like, yes, but it costs time and money.
I mean, if anyone out there is watched this video and wants to talk to a team that is able to do this, definitely hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever, and we're happy to have the conversation. But yeah, it's I'm not saying that it's as easy as just dropping Fusion in a project and magically it will become a bug-free multiplayer experience. Um, but yeah, definitely it is something that is much more an option today than it was maybe several years ago. Um, and yeah, tools like Fusion are a big part of why that is more of an option today than it may have been in the past.
So now circling back to the Fusion Pong itself, and as you mentioned, what I found very interesting is that you use it as an example not only for the people who are working with the SDK itself, but also with the non-technical parts of the game development team, which is, I mean, simply percentage-wise, a whole lot larger because it includes anything from production to operations. Well, operations is technical, but that tends to be a different kind of technical than game game development specific, art, design. What have you found to be the most useful aspects that you're able to convey to these people in terms of how that relates to their role when they build a multiplayer game rather than a single player game?
Yeah, it's a really cool question. And we can sort of, I guess, to sort of answer it in a different sort of way, you can sort of look at how, I guess, Fusion specifically would add value to different disciplines, sort of thing. It's very obvious where the value is for the, say the core development team or the programmers on the team. But for example, the fact that you've got things like Fusion stats, so a super easy like on-screen display, giving you like really like just a wealth of information of what the game simulation is actually doing on each device at any given time, unlocks so much potential, both in terms of development for optimization, but for QA and actually finding issues in the first place. One of the big things that we've always found, again, using tools like Fusion Stats, and there's other sort of networking tools that you can use externally to that as well, like outside of the Unity environment, I should say, is quite often we'll have like reports coming back from QA saying like, hey, we found this weird bug that happened in the game under these situations, and when we go back and actually watch like like the replay of the actual like gameplay, it turns out there wasn't actually a bug in the game. The internet just dropped out for a few seconds, or like the Wi-Fi dropped, or so there's just so many factors that can affect the performance of a multiplayer game. Now, having said that, if there was something unexpected that happened because the internet dropped out, that is still a bug. That is still something that you'd want to be handling within the game itself. But where you would actually, the path you would go down in terms of investigation and what the potential fix would be there is incredibly different if it turns out it's a connection issue as opposed to like a core logic issue or something more into that. Um,
Yeah, I
and
mean, that's definitely something to keep in mind. Like, how I think this is also related to how fast paced your gameplay experience is, and also who you expect to be playing together. Because, I mean, let's face it, if you're playing between Japan and the US, or, well, I mean, you will know that very well living down under, like between Australia and Europe, there are just physical barriers that, okay, you can, if you have like a chess game, then that delay might not be as bad. Or if, a packet drops every now and again, that's not as big of an issue as if you're playing, let's say, Counter Strike between these countries, then in this case, the delay between those two machines might just be too big. And that's something you need to deal with really at the user experience side. It's not a technical problem anymore, unfortunately. It's a physical one, and none that any of us can really surmount unless we go quantum physics, well, quantum physics in this case being actual quantum physics, please, not the
Yes.
actual physics in photon quantum, which is a different topic altogether.
Yeah. One of the big pieces of advice we always give to any QA or any development team working on multiplayer is basically you want to always be trying to test under just the absolute worst possible conditions for your game. So in the same way that if you're say building a mobile game, you don't test it on the absolute latest iPhone 13. Is it 13 the latest iPhone? I think it is the latest iPhone, for example. You test it on the iPhone 7, the iPhone 8. You don't test it on great Wi-Fi connections. You test it running off a 3G or a 4G SIM card if that's where you expect your players to actually be using the device. I'm actually quite fortunate that I work from home most of the time, and obviously during the pandemic I've worked from home the whole time. But our office is 2.5 hours away by train from where I live, and along that way there is a bunch of dead spots, which makes it just the most ideal situation for testing mobile games. Because if I can play a game and have a great experience that entire train ride, then things are looking pretty good. And if you've ever experienced Australian internet connections, it's not great over here. We don't have the best infrastructure in the world, unfortunately, but it is getting better. But yeah, definitely test on different devices, more lower end devices, and more lower end connections, especially for a multiplayer game.
Mm.
Which obviously you can sort of replicate most of that sort of experience as well. Again, with Fusion, when you're running like the debug DLLs, and you can jump in there and sort of tweak the actual connectivity settings. And just yeah, even from day one when you're working on something, just crank some of those sliders right over and just give yourself an idea of how your game is going to perform under less than ideal situations. If you can get it running, if you can give your players a great experience under those conditions, when your players have beautiful fiber, you know wired internet connections, they're going to have a really great time.
Yep.
But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as with crossplay. At the end of the day, you need to test on the lowest common denominator of your player base. And I think this is particularly difficult in mobile, given just the wealth of hardware that you might be working with. Like, it might not even be that the hardware is not suitable, but it's just a manufacturer that you have never encountered and that has a different way of execution certain ops, and then it's got
yeah,
so yeah, that is
that's
definitely more
and I
challenging
mean,
than say going with like another platform, like a console platform that has like specific types of hardware, two different vendors of for like hard drives or CPUs, and then you know what you have to deal with and the spectrum to test against.
yeah, I mean, yeah, console development is generally a bit easier in that regard because you've got obviously a lot less SKUs to sort of target. Um, Although some consoles may not have the best reputation for internet connectivity, so in the same way that you test your more low-end mobile devices, you've got to make sure you're testing across all of your like console SKUs if you are doing like that cross-play sort of title.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's again, it's why we do this. It's fun. This is an aspect of development where you'll come across just the weirdest bugs and the weirdest bug reports, but it's in the same way that I know for myself personally, and a lot of other people get into game development because it's a field where there's always something new. It's a very evolving industry.
Mm.
If you think you know everything, you don't. Um, it's just that's just the nature of the beast. Um, like multiplayer development in particular takes that to the next level where there's always new ways to learn how to optimize a game, new genres that people have thought couldn't possibly be a networked experience. Like again, before games like PUBG or Fortnite, for example, the thought of having 100 players on a multiplayer map running around, and especially when those games were ported to mobile, like that was insane. That was crazy when that sort of became a thing. So doing and I see that smile. I know we're thinking the same thing here. Like doing large scale like battle royale games is just an incredible technical feat. But again, that opens up such incredible areas of design and new genres that maybe we haven't thought of yet. So
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting point you're making because the way I'm looking at it is if you actually read literature on the subject of multiplayer, which is usually, of course, not game development specific, the actual principle of multiplayer tech, like the underlying concepts, haven't actually changed in like 30 years since it first came around. What did change is the performance that we have access to implement these concepts and the infrastructure on which we can run multiplayer games. Because I mean, if we take Fortnite um, and PUBG as an example, this is also only possible because we have server CPUs that can actually simulate that many players in the same world and then separate that information based on area of interest for these different devices to not overload them on the other end. So that's an interesting point. And then as far as I think one thing that you mentioned that is interesting, and that actually also brings us to Zahir's question here about mitigating input lag. This is there are technical solutions, and Fusion offers pretty much all the ones that are state of the art, such as client side prediction and interpolation and everything else that you have in the tech stack. But we need to keep in mind that a lot of the things that make multiplayers feel great are similar to the things that make single player feel great, and that is sound, visuals, and actual gameplay design. Like you have to keep these things that can only be tackled up to a certain point with technology, and then include them in your design process. And think about, okay, how can we afford the actual hardware that we're using more time to exchange information, but so that the player themselves feels that it is still immediate, or at least that the delay is not perceived. Is there anything in particular that comes to your mind here, Marty?
yeah, it's definitely an interesting question, and it's an interesting question to me from the perspective of, is client prediction the only way to mitigate input lag? No. Is it the correct way? Maybe. It really does come down to the specific use case of the game, what input we're actually talking about, the style of game. As you alluded to, like there's I mean, it's game development. We use smoke and mirrors to do a lot of cool tricks. It could be a situation where, if you had an absolute bare bones scene with, say, I don't know, a car controller, for example, where that input, if there is a small amount of, say, input lag between, a player pressing a button and something happening on the screen, that's very apparent to the user. But
Mm,
but keep in mind, a single player game will have some degree of input lag. Like, you press a button on your keyboard, it doesn't happen instantaneously. It's a very small amount of time relative to what might be happening in, say, a hosted multiplayer game if you're not using, say, prediction or interpolation. But in the same way that for a single player game, you would have, say, particle effects, you would, maybe change the field of view on the camera when the player starts moving. There's a lot of things like that, which will sort of, the input lag will still be there, but it's ways that you can hide it from the user. And I think one of the most amazing ways, if you want to look at different techniques that other games are successfully doing this at the moment, would actually be look at technology such as Stadia. Or I know Xbox has something similar. I can't remember what they specifically call it, but cloud-based games. Because in that situation, your input is traveling from your physical controller to a data center, or I'm assuming not within your own house, like unless you've got unless you're living inside a data center, like that input itself is traveling a significant distance, and
mm,
then you're seeing obviously the stream coming back from that device. So if you jump on Stadia or any of those sort of cloud based gaming platforms, have a look at some of the different games on there, and if you play something and you're like, hey, this actually feels like it could be a local game on my own computer, stop and actually ask yourself, all right, I know it isn't. I know there's input lag here. And most of the platforms will tell you what your input lag or latency actually is at any given time,
mm.
and try to work out what those developers have maybe done to really mitigate that. And yeah, there's a plethora of different ways you could approach that.
Yeah, and I think that's also an interesting example. Actually, I hadn't thought of it because those are also single player games. So the the techniques are not only things that you would use in a multiplayer context. It's just it's much more necessary there than in a single player. And as soon as you go online, then you kind of have to think about it for your single player game as well. Um, I think for me, there's one absolutely fantastic example on how these client side prediction is combined with sound effects, scores, and user feedback, and that's Counter Strike. If you are, for instance, playing your Counter Strike game and having a sniper shooting somebody, and you technically did a headshot, but of course, as we all know, there is latency on the network, regardless of what your connection is. And if you actually analyze exactly what is happening, is you have the shot. So you have the SFX of the shot happening immediately as you press down the button. As soon as the hit lands on your screen, so that is, we're still talking about client-side prediction here. You have a sound effect of the hit landing. This, you then scope out, and then a fraction of a second later, you get the confirmation of the kill in terms of visual effects or points. And at that point, you have another SFX, a very subtle one that confirms the actual effect of the hit. And this is particularly noticeable if you didn't hit and you get killed. Like if you have these two situations next to one another, you will notice that part of the feedback that the user is getting is actually missing because you didn't actually land the hit. And so there's a lot of like also psychological tricks that you can use to make this delay not be apparent to your user that have literally nothing to do with the technology itself, but that you do in combination with technological solutions to kind of like hide away or play on our expectations as players, as to what we should be seeing or hearing at a given point.
Yeah, as I said, it's unfortunately it's one of those questions where there is never going to be that one golden ticket that will be the perfect solution for every single game. And again, this circles back to why multiplayer development is such a interesting and exciting field, because there isn't one size fits all. It will really come down to looking at what in particular is happening in your game, even to the extent where what you're mentioning there as input lag may not necessarily be input lag. There could be something within your game logic itself, which is where the input is being received correctly at the, maybe you are using client side prediction, but for whatever reason, maybe there's a logic issue where the player isn't moving straight away, or maybe there's like a delay in the animation controller
Hmm.
of that player. There's as I said, we could literally spend the rest of, well, your day and my evening talking about all the potential things that could be there. It's just it's yeah it's and that's the thing. This is one tiny facet of multiplayer development, and that we could literally talk for days. And we could grab Eric on this, and we could talk for weeks.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
sure. I have no doubt Eric has very strong opinions on this. Um, and I'm probably going to message him on Discord later and ask. But yeah, it's just yeah, definitely. I guess to try and give Zahir, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I guess some sort of answer. Um, the best example or path forward I could suggest would be to take a look at similar games. Obviously if you're using Fusion, obviously on the Fusion website there's a bunch of different demos. I'm not just going to say check out Fusion Pong. Like there's plenty of really awesome ones out there. Tank the Rock is super fun. For the shout out to the guys who made that. Oh, Erickson. There you go. Hey Eric. Eric's in chat now.
Hey
Um,
Eric.
yeah. Yeah. Have a look at what other games are doing, and yeah, hopefully there might be some inspiration there. But don't just look at what those games in particular are doing from a purely networking coding perspective, but also look into, is there a particle effect? Is there a camera trick going on? Like, what are they actually doing where they may be just, approaching the same problem you have, but dealing with it in a different way?
Hmm. And
So,
actually,
hope.
like, if we kind of speaking again of like what you mentioned before, that the types of connections that are available to us, we spend a lot of time on about talking of the quality of connection. But Manu here asked an interesting question: is that the connection type. So there being two, direct connection and relayed. So the reason that we need to take those into consideration as well is that while direct connection is usually preferred because, well, that means you can exchange data directly with the server or the host of the game. Not all devices manage to punch through to that connection. That can be for any number of reasons, whether you have a firewall in the middle, whether your ISP doesn't allow that. I mean, mobile games are usually on a relay connection, for instance. And this is really, it has nothing to do with what you as a developer can do. If you have a dedicated server, you have a bigger likelihood to get a punch, but it's not guaranteed. I think statistically, we're somewhere in the 7 to 9% range of any player not being able to punch to the device. Last time I checked industry articles on the subject, so it is there. It should not necessarily impact your experience, but the difference is that there is an additional intermediary in the relayed connection, which is the cloud, that ensures that the data is still being, as the name implies, relayed to the clients that have not been able to establish a direct connection. This is actually something, well, going back to what you mentioned regarding QA and Fusion stats, something you can see in the Fusion stats as well to see what type of connection that is and whether or not it might have impacted, the experience that you have seen. But ultimately, this is really more something that we all have to live with, and that's being handled by mostly security mechanisms that are out of anybody's control here at a much deeper level within the internet infrastructure.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the for us one of the big selling points when we are chatting with potential clients about which networking frameworks and infrastructures to look at using is the fact that obviously Photon Cloud does handle all that pretty much seamlessly, behind the scenes. There's very little work that a developer would need to do for managing all that. And probably a really great example of where that saved us as developers a huge amount of time and effort is we actually this was a pun project, but obviously this applies very much to the more recent Photon products as well. We actually developed a agile training tool. It was a top down, similar to a couch co-op style of experience, but obviously all online multiplayer. I'm not sure if I can name it, but I'll find out later, and I can link it in the chat if we can.
These
If you've played,
pesky NDAs that we all have to live with, right?
if you've played, say, Overcooked, you've got a pretty good idea of what this game was like,
Mhm.
basically. We built it in pun, obviously, but it was an agile training tool, so it was teaching teams communication skills, working together, stuff like that, but in the context of a game. It was super fun to work on. Um, but what we sort of realized is our target audience for this training tool, more so on game/training tool, would be a lot of people in corporate environments, behind
Mm,
corporate firewalls and corporate internet connections.
mm.
And I believe most of the players we had for that game would have been on some form of like relay connection, because
Yeah,
just due
that
to the nature of the connections they were on.
yeah, so I mean, corporate environments are a whole different deal. I mean, for obvious reasons, they tend to have much stricter firewall rules, um, that oftentimes just, kill connections because they don't deem them trustworthy enough. A typical example, well, that you mentioned as well, is games. As soon as you're trying to ping any URL that includes a blacklisted word, you can be pretty sure that it's gonna get, well, stopped or at least slowed down to becoming unusable. And that's actually, in these situations, we all actually do have offerings through Photon Industries that tackle all of these very special requirements that are corporate specific. Those are not issues that you have to really worry if you're building a game in the strict sense of the word that is going to be played by people at home on their phone on the go. But as soon as you go into things that are edutainment or corporate environments, you really need to get in touch with Photon Industries in order to get these special setups, because otherwise, you won't get around these specific issues that do require a whole lot more support, different technical aspects in the infrastructure, not in the technology, mind you, but it's really about the things that have to be set up for your connections. And these are not specific to your game. They're just years and years of experience with corporate IT, really.
I mean, that's probably also that point there is a really good segue. I guess just to give a shout out to Photon Circle, and that sort of level of support that's available through that for various teams. It's definitely, again, it's quite a unique offering in the market, to have that level of very much one-on-one style of support, and being able to, like, having the opportunity to reach out specifically and be able to talk to the person who wrote the code that you're using, is, again, one, is a game changer, but is also, a huge time saver, in a lot of different ways as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, I might be able to help some people with some physics stuff, but especially if you work in quantum, then well, our physics engineer who actually wrote the physics engine will undoubtedly know a whole lot more and a whole lot more in depth what's going on with a specific system than I will ever know. Because well, that's what he spends all his time on. Uh, yeah, definitely.
I know one big thing, and you and I think touched on this like off stream earlier. That it's definitely worth shouting out. Is just, yeah, if you are running into any bugs or issues working with a stack such as Fusion, 9 times out of 10, update Fusion and the bug will go away. Or like, I mean, I'll let you sort of touch on this, because I wouldn't want to get it wrong. But what you call a nightly build, we had a bit of disagreement on if it actually was what would be you'd consider a nightly version or build.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is again like as soon as you go into terminology, there are different levels of definitions. You have like what does the industry at large understand? What is the convention in the world, and like so across industries, and also what do you mean yourself? Um, and I think because we have such a close touch, especially with our more so circle customers, we know where the pain points are in a specific thing, and we can, since they are in touch directly with the actual engineers who wrote the system, a fix can be implemented almost, well, not immediately, because again, we're humans, we need processing time just as the internet does require time to transfer information, but the fixes get implemented very quickly. And thanks to our continuous integration pipeline, we can also make sure that this fix gets included immediately into the next version that is being made available. And so the stable version really is the LTS version. It's like, okay, this won't change. This is not going to evolve. You can use that and be safe. But if you really want the latest, most optimized version with all the fixes, then just upgrade to the new version that we call nightly. It hasn't been frozen yet, but we're very confident in it. And as you may already have noticed in the community, both in the community Discord as well as in the Circle Discord, whenever an issue is being reported, our first question is, okay, which Unity version do you use? Which SDK version do you use? And if it's not the latest, there is a very good chance that we'll ask you to upgrade because that issue might already have been fixed in the meantime.
Yeah, as I said, it's interesting because a lot of the time when you hear any sort of thing being referred to as like as a nightly build, you're thinking of something being very much bleeding edge, which obviously, in this case is true for Fusion, but you generally think of it as not being stable or production ready. Whereas, like I said, definitely in our experience, I would say that's definitely not the case with Fusion. Um, it's, yeah, 99 times out of 100, you want to be on that whatever that latest nightly release is, because you will get better performance. And as I said, there's so many bug fixes, that you'll see on the changelogs going through all the time as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's what some of the things that we, of course, advise anybody working with us. But returning more to your experience with your customers, like what are some of the most important pieces of advice that you see yourself repeating, regardless of the game or the team? that you're advising on? Because if I'm not mistaken, you go anywhere from like independent to AAA to, of course, as we just heard from yourself, also more like corporate type of games. Or, I mean, experiences, I should almost say at this point, rather than games. So what are the like the, are there anything where you go, "Oh yes, that's true across any of the games I've worked on," or specific games that you feel, "Okay, this is understated?"
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. And as I said, like we do chat with, I will chat to and work with a variety of businesses and studios of various sizes and projects of various sizes as well, ranging from mobile through to console and stuff like that. Um, if there's one very common piece of advice, it really does come back to not underestimating the value of QA and testing. Um, Multiplayer games in particular, like I mean, the running joke in game development is that you change the texture on a tank and your main menu will stop working. Um, we work with incredibly complex systems. We have very intertwined systems. What was it? Was it? I think it was like Half-Life 2 or Portal or something. There's an image of like a pineapple or something in the game, and if you take it out, the game
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
run.
I mean,
If some,
honestly, those videos and reading source code is absolutely gorgeous. It also gives a good insight as to how messy actual game development is compared to tools development, which, well, we at Photon are in.
yeah,
But yeah, game development is just as much a craft as it's an art form rather than just like software engineering.
absolutely. Or the one I love, and I apologize if I get the game wrong. I think it was the first Wing Commander, where they realized like a week before release that, or before like submission or whatever it was back then, that when you close the game, it would crash. And their solution was they just changed the error message for the crash to "Thank you for playing Wing Commander," and shipped, and off it went. It was
Yeah.
great. But yeah, definitely. Um, for a multiplayer game, you need to be testing it almost on a daily basis. You need to be testing it with as many different people as possible, as early as possible,
Mm.
and you need to be testing it on the actual hardware where you expect the game to run. You will discover a myriad of bugs, design decisions, like so many different things when you take a game out of the Unity editor and put it on an
Mm.
actual phone. Or you'll find things that will work great in Unity, but the second you actually put it on, for example, a console development kit, running different SDKs, running different frameworks under the hood, everything just falls to pieces.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
it's
even just something as simple, switching your build from being debugged to release will have a huge impact on performance. Or, I mean, of course, just switching from mono to IL to CPP. You there are a lot of things, and I think this is actually this is an interesting point as well, where you have to consider, is that an issue with the game, or is it a performance issue because of how we're currently building it out? And that's also why you tend to have development machine which are so completely overkill, because you need to run in these lower performance modes for debugging and QA. But unfortunately, it's not matching what you just said, the hardware that the end user will have. So at some point, you'll have to actually go into IL2 CPP, into release builds, and try to profile and evaluate them, because there are so many like small things in these conversion steps that might go wrong, that are not specific to anything you've done, but that are engine or platform specific, that you really need to test those as well. That's true for multiplayer and for single player.
absolutely. And I guess to give, I guess, a sneak peek for one of the upcoming talks that I'm hoping to do, I mean, hopefully by the end of the year on our YouTube, we're going to do a deep dive into our CI/CD pipelines, and
Oh,
all that like build automation stuff. Because again, like it's great for me to sit here and say you need to test your builds daily on all your different devices, but if that means you've got to have a developer sitting there in front of a machine watching Unity build all day, that's generally going to be a deal breaker for a lot of teams. So yeah, that'll be something. Hopefully, we can put that talk together by the end of the year.
well, I think,
Um,
if we're talking about CI/CD, there's two things. When we talk about um, testing, there are really two types of tests. We all know about unit tests, and they're all great for like technical function and everything. But at the end of the day, we need to keep in mind that players are humans, and humans don't exactly behave in always rational ways. So, best thing you can do is, of course, have actual human players test that. And if you have a very close, tight community, have like a closed group of, like, for instance, speedrunners or exploiters that are fans of your game, and just have them get a run at it, because they will absolutely for sure find ways to break it. And you need to know whether these things are gameplay breaking or things that you can live with, because you think, speedrunning is its own community with its own set of challenges, for instance. And sometimes there's things you don't want to take away because it's not relevant to, well, 99% of the other community, and doesn't have a negative impact. So there are different types of QA to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always an interesting experience whenever you have a game get handed from a developer to just a member of the public. They will interact with your game in ways that you never expected.
Mhm.
Um, when we're talking about a multiplayer experience, which is multiple people interacting with each other, they will find things that you hadn't thought possible, and it will break your game in a
Always.
myriad of weird and wonderful ways. But I mean, like I said, obviously I was talking very specific about more QA style testing, but your more general like public or open testing is amazing because your players will find new game modes for you. Your players will show you where the fun is. You'll think you're creating a competitive shooter, and you'll build this amazing community who gets really excited about your building mechanic or your crafting mechanic or like a whole heap of different things. Um, the project I'm actually working on at the moment, we implemented a new game mode for this particular game. I've got to talk very vaguely about this one, purely because in testing, part of the testing we were doing is we would do the opposite thing to what you expected the players to do, and it turned out to be way more fun than the actual main game loop that we had built. Um, so we're like, well, hang on, we're all doing this every time we test the game because it's more fun. Why don't we just do this and like add this as a game mode for the game? And it was actually really quick to implement because we'd all been doing it, so we knew exactly what it needed to be. So yeah, definitely. I mean, this is game development generally, but
Mm,
especially in a multiplayer context, there are so many different kinds of testing, as you said, that you need to be thinking about when you are developing your game. Um, but yeah, definitely having a solid QA process
mm.
um, is always going to lead to you having a better product at the end.
I mean, we also have to keep in mind, as you said, especially with public testing and everything, your players will play more hours on the day of release than you will have spent doing QA. And this is literally
Absolutely.
just a numbers game. You can only test so much until you have to release something to the public. And I mean, there's this infamous saying that if you're happy with your product when you release it, you worked on it for too long. Um, because it's never perfect. Like, perfect is the enemy of done, as we say in production.
Yeah.
And so
Um,
that's definitely something to
yeah.
keep in mind.
It's similar to a question we used to get asked a lot, and it happens a lot less frequently these days. Where we would talk to clients who were worried about like they think of like an online multiplayer game, and their first thought is that that encourages people cheating or hacking or things along those lines. And we obviously know there's a plethora of ways to build your game in such a way that that's just not really a possibility these days. But it's also on the flip side, if you create a multiplayer game and it gets big enough that people are going out of their way to cheat, you've also kind of made it. Like you've got that and if people are cheating your game, cool. Like there's enough people playing it that clearly. I mean you should definitely address that in some way, but
Mm,
it's almost like a metric of success in some regards.
definitely. I mean, it's proportional to your amount of success, as you said. If you get popular enough, it's not a question of if, but when. Now, I mean, of course, depending on what you build, whether it's in state transfer determinism, there's a lot of like built-in security already. But if you need additional security, especially with the things that you get from us, there's a lot you can do post-launch without actually changing anything on the client side. So this is also an important part, I think, like if we take that tangent a bit further, is that you need to think about cheating, but you shouldn't overthinking just yet. Like it's a gradual process. Like the other question, I mean, as we just mentioned before, is how much are you preventing innovation within your own game? Like, are you preventing actual cheating that might impact the user experience for everybody or your economy, or are you just limiting the player choices? And if we go back to finding new game modes, I think one of the best example is Warframe. Warframe started out as something that was super super slow paced as a game, and then players found this like weird bug where they could helicopter with a sword of some sort and just like speed through maps. And then the devs were like, "Oh, we want to lean into that. That's really fun." And now Warframe is one of the most fast-paced games that you have on the market. But originally, it wasn't intended to be that way. So, as you
Yeah,
said,
it's
sometimes just lean into what you see your players like, even if it's not expected. And then that comes often times from ways you don't think about, and therefore something that can limit or improve that is also how strict you are with your game rules and what you consider quote unquote cheating. So I think this is definitely a concept that also as gameplay designers you have to be aware of, and not only programmers, because we tend to get stuck with, hey, they shouldn't be able to do that, forbid it. It's really something that you have to take a more holistic approach to see, okay, what is the actual impact on the ecosystem, and what are the pros and cons of it.
Yeah, I mean, we're moving more into design here, but which again, we could talk about this, for hours on end. But yeah, definitely consider if again, if your game gets to a scale where you have people doing things that weren't part of your original design, definitely look at is that adding or taking away from the experience of other players as well as the experience of that particular player.
Mm,
If someone's able to do something in your game and they find it really fun and it's not necessarily affecting the experience for everyone else, let them do it.
mm,
Or look at it as an additional game mode if it's popular enough. Like definitely, work with your community in that regard. And even it could be a case of maybe you have it's something you disable in say ranked modes, but you enable it in your casual gameplay modes or stuff more along those lines.
yeah. I think one good example of that is if we go like to unexpected findings in multiplayer games is how Counter-Strike evolved. Bunny hopping wasn't meant to be possible. Crouch jumping was a bug in the original source engine and got actually, because it was so popular, it has been implemented and as a feature in the in the next version. So, there's a bunch of stuff like that where you go like, "Yeah, that's weird, that's odd. We didn't think of that. We don't want it, but everybody loves it. So, let's keep
I,
the
I
traction
remember
going."
I remember back in the day playing Counter Strike. Coincidentally, I've played a lot of multiplayer games. Who would have thought? Like like when you could stack players. I remember watching like the Pub Masters like Counter Strike movie. And all the crazy like trick shots and things they would pull off by stacking multiple players up on top of each other in weird spots around the map and things like that.
Mm,
And again, I'm sure that was never part of the original design of the game, but I'm sure the designers looked at it and said, well, hey, is this actually a negative experience, or is it actually, allowing players to have, cool new tactics and stuff like that? And, obviously, I mean, it's still in the game today, as far as I'm aware. So they've obviously made the decision that it's, something they want to add in. Is it realistic that you can have three people stacked on top of each other running around a map like that? No. Is it fun? Yeah. And at the end of the day, we make games. Like,
uh,
yeah, like games should be fun. Like it's yeah.
that's for sure. All right. Well, I mean, I think we really spoke about everything. Is there any other like advice that you usually give to your clients that you want to like still slot in before we move on to the couple of community questions we still got here in chat?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things like let's just bullet point it, I guess. Testing is super important in a multiplayer game. Testing on your real devices, like your real target audience, sort of thing. Um, Thinking through the decisions you make when you are doing multiplayer development is super important. Working with your team is really important with that. For example, like especially when it comes down to the more nuanced parts of like optimization, like what needs to be networked on, say, a player or in your scene, for example. Are there things that you don't need to network? Are there things that for example, you don't need to network between the players because you can determine them locally on each client based on other information that you have available within the simulation. Um, there's a lot of nuanced areas like that where you can find some incredible optimizations just by changing some of your logic around with things like that. Um, yeah, there's a lot of different things, but yeah, testing, yeah, and working hand in hand with design is very, very important. Um, Making sure that what you're building what you're building may be fun in a single player context, but the needs that you'll have around design and what players will find fun in a multiplayer context can be very different. So yeah, definitely things to consider there as well.
And I think here it's important to mention that includes visual design.
Hmm.
There's like as they say, especially for well, anything that lives on this planet, like we look a certain way because we adapt to the function that we have in our everyday, and that is the same is true in games. Like things need to look and feel based on the purpose also that they're supposed to fulfill. So don't underestimate how much your art team has to weigh in on these kind of things either.
And yes,
um
especially as we sort of touched on with that question from chat, that yeah, there will be issues that you can't solve as a programmer in any game, but especially in a multiplayer game, where your art team, your FX team, your technical artists would have the ability to resolve those in ways that may be outside of your particular skill set. So yeah, definitely working with your whole team is super important.
so we have an interesting question here still from Zahir, and I think it's one of these misunderstandings, kind of like going back to what we mentioned before, like the internet is not perfect and there is delay. So they mentioned that there is kind of like this teleportation issue when you hit a ball when you hit a ball on your side, but that might not have been seen like this on the other end, creating a visual artifact. This is simply due to the fact that it cannot be predicted. Increasing your simulation ticks is not going to help with that either because the information still needs to travel. So this is really something that you have to handle with either error correction and or interpolation. So this is really nothing that you can completely avoid by just changing settings, but you have to decide how you want to handle it from a player experience point of view.
Yeah, I guess just to touch on, I can see Eric in chat is sort of giving some advice on that as well. And just I guess the discussion around like tick rate versus like latency. Definitely to sort of think of it. When we talk about simulation like tick rate, we're talking about how frequently each device or each client within the multiplayer game is actually sending a packet out, whereas the latency is how long it takes for each of those packets to actually arrive at their destination. Um, and yeah, obviously, if you are sending more packets, it's giving you more information to go through. That obviously you can use at the other end to rebuild the simulation as accurately as possible if you're in host client or whatever it happens to be. Um, but yeah, there's never gonna, as I said, there's never gonna be a one size fits all.
No.
Specifically when we're talking about, like, so I think Zahir was asking about for games like Fusion Pong, for example. Um, a couple of ideas you could look at could be one, if your ball is moving too fast and you are getting those sort of visual artifacts, you could just slow the ball down. That could definitely be something to look at there.
Yeah.
One thing I have actually seen happen sometimes, if you're working in a game, this wouldn't be like a Pong related thing, this is a more general networking thing. If you're working in a game that's a very large game area, whereas, instead of, say Fusion Pong, for example, where the ball might be moving, say, 1 unit per second, if you're in, say, a large, say, MMO scale environment, that ball might be moving, say, 500 units per second. Um, where you're going to start running into some math limitations, or where if you are having high latency or high delays, where you don't have enough time, like you will get visual artifacting because you've just got so much more space, even if you are doing some different interpolation things. Um, but yeah, it's but again, I guess to circle back of potential other ways you could fix it. you could look at maybe doing some sort of animation on the ball when the ball actually hits like the paddle, for example, having it like squish in and out. If you actually, I'm sure the slow mo guys would have videos of that on YouTube of what a ball actually looks like in slow motion when it actually bounces on something, and the ball will like deform in and move back out and stuff like that. Um, so there's definitely a lot of different ways to approach that sort of problem.
Yeah. So Eric mentioned also input prediction at this point. Yes, the sample that implements that is Fusion cards. So, but also keep that in mind. Like prediction is never completely accurate. It's like you have some games, for instance, like Fusion cards lends itself very well to input prediction, as would Pong, as a matter of fact, because you have a certain amount of inertia, like the movement keeps on going in a certain direction. But what we need to keep in mind is that player action are by nature unpredictable. That means especially things like jumping, shooting, direction changes, they cannot be predicted. Like you don't know because they have their own mind. I mean, that's the beauty and also the downside of us humans. um so the question is really often more, how do you handle misprediction that is absolutely unavoidable, rather than how do you predict better? Because prediction is based on historical information. Think weather forecasting. Weather forecasting is based on what was happening before, and you assume it will keep on these patterns. If something breaks these patterns, which players very often do as far as input is concerned, then something will have to get changed.
I was literally about to mention what Eric just mentioned, where inertia can be a really great way to try to mitigate some of this a little bit. Because when we're saying that player actions are inherently unpredictable, if you have a game where using maybe Counter Strike as a great example, where a player can move in any direction basically any point in time. Like basically, you can be running in one direction, switch your input, and you'll start moving in the other direction straight away. In that sort of environment, as I said, prediction is basically impossible because while you might predict, okay, they're going to keep going in that direction, if they do, change in a sudden way that is impossible to predict, there's not really anything you can do about that. If you have more control over the potential ways that a player may choose to change their input, and I guess like fusion carts would be a great example of that, where yeah, you do have all the inputs, but the cart is generally going to keep moving in a forwards direction unless something crazy happens. That might be a way to look at. So in Fusion Pong specifically, maybe having the paddles slow to a stop and
Mm.
then reverse, regardless of, or take into account the player inputs, could be a way to potentially deal with that.
I mean, that's how you have it also in the advanced KCC. You have like a stopping momentum. Like it doesn't go from 1 to 0 immediately. I mean, neither do we.
Yeah.
When I walk in the street, like even when I'm stopping, like my body still moves like a couple of centimeters in a direction. So this allows you, again, this is not like a technical solution, but it is a way of providing time to information to be exchanged. And that is really the key aspect, is like, yes, what can you do to provide more time to your systems, to your players, to your perception, to get the information they need to reconstruct the whole scene in front of their eyes or in their mind.
Yeah, and I guess it circles back nicely to what we were talking about earlier, where when you are doing multiplayer development, you need to think about things differently. You need to not only think of like in this particular example, like how do you give the best experience to the local player? When they press the forward button or the back button, what do they expect to see on screen? But then, what would you expect to happen on, for a proxy? What do you expect to happen on other people's devices?
Mm.
What do you expect to happen, maybe on a server if you're running like a host client or a dedicated server environment? So it's a different way of thinking about your core game mechanics. Um, but yeah, definitely. Again, one of the great things with Fusion is there is obviously some really great documentation, a lot of sample projects available out there,
Mm.
um, as well as like the inbuilt components, such as like the network rigid body, network transforms, or even I don't think the KCC is part of Fusion. I think you still have to download that separately, or is that?
Well, you have the prototype, like the network character controller prototype, which you can use, as the name implies, to get something quickly out and prototype things. But ultimately you will want to use the advanced KCC, or even better, write your own, because just like the issue we discussed just now with Marty, it ha- is really very game specific. Like we can give you general advice on like techniques that work, but how you implement it really depends on your gameplay. So we can't tell you, oh, this is good, this is bad, because it's too specific to what you're building. And the KCC tends to be another thing like that. Is, first of all, do you even want a KCC? Do you need it to be kinematic, or do you need a physics character controller? And all of these things will depend on, okay, what does it control? Does it control a car? Does it control a human? Does it control a human with special abilities? Does it control an animal? Is it on 2 feet, 3 feet, foot? It's like, there's any amount of information here where you really have to then decide, okay, what does that mean for me, and how do we implement that in the game? So there's only so much generic advice we can give you to take away on these subjects before you have to test it out as on the implementation front.
But again, when you are going down that path of trying to work out which way would be the best way to going, definitely, have a look at the examples out there. Reach out maybe on the Photon Discord. If you're a Circle member, reach out on Circle. Just chat with other developers who potentially have tackled the issues that you've tackled in the past, and can sort of give you some advice and point you down the right path.
So we got another question here from Manu. How can we test bad network connections? Well, the couple. The best way to test it is having a bad internet connection. I don't wish that on you, but
Move to
you
Australia.
need.
That's yeah,
Well, that's one way. Depending on where you locate it, it might be a bit expensive, though. Um,
a bit cold. It's a bit cold here at the moment. We're in the middle of winter still, so yeah.
yeah. The other ways are, of course, you can use Fusion Stat. I believe there might be a couple of things in the actual network project config itself. I
Yeah,
I'm not
on
too
the
experienced with that. Marty, do you remember if they're in there as well?
in the debug DLL, if you go into
Right.
your network project config, you can go down and where is it? Yeah, under network, I believe it is. There's a bunch of settings there to basically artificially add latency and packet loss to the game. Clumsy, as Eric mentioned, is another great little tool.
Exactly.
But yeah, as I was saying earlier, just around testing, as early as possible in your testing environment, just crank those settings up just to see what happens. You may find that maybe some of the logic you're using, or some of the way you've built specific systems, might work great under perfect conditions. But the second you start having a bit of packet loss or something like that, maybe everything starts falling apart. So the earlier you're able to identify that, is definitely valuable. And then obviously making sure that you're also, if possible, testing on real devices under as close to real world situations as what you expect your players to actually be on. So, if you're on mobile, make sure you're testing on a mobile device using, for example, a 3G or a 4G connection. Halfway through a game, put your phone into airplane mode just to see what happens. There's a lot of value out of that sort of real on-device testing, especially, definitely if you are doing mobile development, because obviously, as Tim mentioned earlier, we're generally, as developers, going to be sitting on relatively good machines, with hopefully relatively good internet connections. Um, and our average players may not be in that exact same situation.
I mean, if you want to like, if we want to, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of summarize it, is like build your systems locally, test them, then build and test game feel online.
Absolutely.
That's
Um,
kind of the way to to bullet point
and
it. But there's no way around real time, like real environment testing. And also, well, while we're circling back to that, an important decision when testing is deciding what you don't support. Like, do you want to support 1,000 milliseconds in lag? Frankly, there are very, very few games that can tolerate that. Well, we're talking here specifically about real-time games. If you are asynchronous or well, I mean, like chess, for instance, or really asynchronous, like the things where you make a move, then log off, wait for somebody else to play a move, like Scrabble, for instance. Then of course, a milliseconds is not a big deal. But if you are in a game that's fast-paced, or even just even World of Warcraft, like that really piles up on, and then you, as a developer, you have to decide, okay, where do you draw the line? As yeah, sorry, that's just not realistic anymore, and we can't support everything.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of that will generally come down to more of a business decision, um, where as I said, you've got to draw the line. If it's a situation where you've got a percentage of your user base on certain devices or certain internet connections, or in a certain part of the world where maybe you don't have dedicated servers or something like that. Um, Unfortunately, yeah, there'll be a business decision of, can we support these players? Hopefully, the answer is yes, but unfortunately, sometimes the answer will be no, and that's just. And again, that also comes back to having good community relationship or good relationships with your community. Please don't one of the most valuable people on a multiplayer development team is your community manager. We build multiplayer social experiences. Shout outs to all the community managers out there. I don't know how you do it. Yeah, that's one of the hardest jobs in game development that no one ever thinks of.
Oh yeah,
Um,
oh yeah,
but
they're
yeah,
basically the front line, really. Like, I
oh,
mean, we
absolutely,
might
yeah,
get some of it, but ultimately, they are the first line of defense, if you will, on all of these
yeah,
subjects. So
yeah.
treat them
Any
well.
feed, yeah, any feedback you're getting as a developer that's coming through your community manager, believe me when I say that that person has filtered it, and they've taken care of 100 other player issues before it even gets to you in the first place. So yeah, definitely of that concept of building a community and having a well supported community manager is vitally important. As a bonus, I guess just a developer tip here: community managers, from my experience, love coffee and love cakes. So treat your community managers really well.
All right. So wait, fast-paced multiplayer game like air hockey. Well, as a matter of fact, air hockey, I would be tempted to say don't build it in Fusion, build it in Quantum.
Yeah, that's that would definitely be. How long do we have? There's definitely, yeah. If like this is another hour talk. If you're
No,
looking
it
at that,
is, yeah.
yeah. If you're looking at a fast-paced multiplayer game where you need to have a level of determinism, or where there is value in having a deterministic environment for the game to be running, definitely have a look at Fusion versus Quantum. Um, I know. I think some of the Quantum documentation is public, even if you don't have a Circle account.
It will be most likely in the foreseeable future. As per usual, I should actually get a no ETA button installed here. I was like, that flashes.
Yeah.
But
Um,
I think that the easy way to take a look at it, whether your game will be better suited for quantum or fusion and which topology within these technical solutions, is by taking a look at the quadrants that we've built in the product sheets, which we've built over the last 2 years and keep iterating on by simply analyzing what type of game genres and by extent gameplay is something that we have basically broken down to, okay, it's not only what is typically being used in technology, but also what should be used. So keep in mind that the what we advise is what will make your life easier, not only what will make what is possible. So there's a lot of technical possibilities that are, I mean, that you'll wreck your head with. Like there's stuff that you can build with quantum you should rather build with fusion, and the other way around. The advice that we give you is what is going to be easier to develop with for your gameplay, and what will ultimately not only make it more stress free and but also quicker to develop. So it's for you, for your business, and for your users as well, because ultimately that's who you need to keep in consideration. And yes, I saw your messages on Slack, Eric, and I saw your messages, Marty, Tim, as well. Quantum will eventually be available for free, as well as the documentation, most likely the documentation prior to the SDK. We're working on that. And you can be sure that when it becomes available, we will let you guys know, because I know for a fact that the community has been itching to get their hands on it. It's been available in the circle for the last 5 years already, or almost 6 years, I believe, at this point. And and it
Um,
will become available later at
yeah,
freely as well.
yeah. I'm hoping at some point in the future I get to put together we've done Fusion Pong, but we'll put together a Quantum Pong
Well,
demo as well, which
yeah,
would
we
be
can have another discussion about quantum at a later date, because I mean that's actually what I started with when I was still a student. As a matter of fact, I was one of these kind of edge cases that got access to it very, very early. And I didn't know anything about networking or multiplayer game development. And my team of three, all of us second year students, build a multiplayer co-op zombie shooter that played well at up to 400 milliseconds latency between Japan and Sweden, where they were based and I was based in Tokyo at the time. So it is pretty magical, but it is not, the one solution that fits everything. Fusion and quantum are just two different technologies that tackle multiplayer and the requirements and issues in multiplayer games from two very different angles. So it's really not about is this better than the other one, but whether what is better for the problems that you will be facing in your gameplay and your game genre to develop the ultimate gameplay experience that you are aiming for.
there's two sides to this I would sort of touch on. One is definitely, and this is a bit of advice that we give to a lot of our clients that we're chatting to. Um, Circle, like Photon Circle, does have a 30-day trial, I guess you'd call it, or an
Oh.
introductory sort of month. Um,
Exactly. For the teams that do have a track record already and do have a concrete plan for the game that they want to build, there are trials available. They're evaluated on a individual basis. So, email developer at photonengine.com with background information on your team, your company, and the project you're trying to develop. And then it will be evaluated for that 30-day trial.
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're trying to make that decision of should we be using Fusion or Quantum or something like that, who better to talk to than the people that actually make Fusion and Quantum
True.
and related? Yeah, so that's definitely a valuable sort of resource to keep in mind there.
All right. I think this is also a good point to kind of stop. Otherwise, I mean, we'll go on forever. I know you and I can go on pretty much forever on these subjects. But unfortunately, the day ends for you and my day still has to continue. So let's move on to the closing argument, so to speak. Marty, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been absolutely a delight talking with you. And I mean, Fusion Pong is definitely a great thing that people should be looking into. If it's helpful to your customers who are teams and studios, then I'm sure it will be useful for individuals as well. Take a look at it. And, you know, we're looking forward to having you on the show again when Quantum is free and when you've built, well, not only Quantum Pong, but other stuff. Or have an announced game and you want to do a post-mortem. I like these for multiplayer games are also fascinating.
I'm looking forward to the day that I can jump on a call with yourself and or Eric and actually talk about some of the projects we're working on at the moment. But for any of my clients that are watching this at the moment, please let me talk about it because it'd be super cool. And we're doing some really cool stuff. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting things happening in multiplayer development. And yeah, Fusion obviously, or Fusion and or Quantum, depending on your particular project, are definitely tools that you should be looking into if it suits the use case.
And so, until the next stream, join the Noma Studio Discord, join the Photon Community Discord, ask your questions there. We'll be able to redirect you based on what you need. And as a final closing information, yes, so here the Circle membership is available also for individuals, but again, it has to be handled through our business team. So do please send us an email and they will be able to provide you with the information and the steps required for that. On that note, once again, Marty, thank you very much for joining us. Everybody at home, thank you very much for tuning in. We're looking forward to seeing you at the next Photon Insiders stream. And until then, stay well and make cool games. See you around.
Have a good day, everyone.